Today we are enjoying Historic Boulder's Mid-Century Modern Tour, happening here in Table Mesa. So it looks like those people are hikers. So hi. So I think we'll get started. And we are just logistics. We're starting at the top of the hill, and we're going to walk downhill most of the way, all the way down. At the very bottom, which will be at the bottom of Vassar, then we can carpool back up to your cars, and then from here we'll drive up to NCAR. So if people have more interest, we can go up to NCAR, and I'll tour you around there. It's a spectacular site and a great way to finish this tour. This tour is going to be focusing primarily on houses, but I'll be telling stories about other parts of Table Mesa. My name is Leonard Siegel. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Boulder. We have some other Historic Boulder members, and past President and Administrator Bob Muckle and Melanie Muckle. Thank you for helping in organizing this.
What time do you expect to finish?
It's great. So we should be done with the whole thing by 11:30, including NCAR. Okay? So,
We have another board member too,
oh, Linda. So, and and a little bit of background. I'm an architect by training, and I've also taught at the University of Colorado. And you know, you come to Boulder and you just look at those Flatirons and you just think, architects can't ever do anything that measures up to that, but there's some who have really surpassed that. And I'm going to brag a little bit about Linda's dad. Linda's dad is Charles Hartling. Charles Hartling, I believe, was the greatest design architect who ever practiced in Colorado, in all of Colorado. Yes, just amazing. He invented architecture with every single project that he did. We're going to walk by one of his houses. Unfortunately, there's fences, a big fence around it. You're not going to be able to see very much of it. This tour was the brainchild of another architect named Deborah Yin, and I worked with her to put this tour together as a part of a series of walking tours that are also digital. So you can go to a site, and it's an app called Pocket Sites, or go to the internet and download Pocket Sites, and you can take this tour in the comfort of your couch with air conditioning or whatever you want to do. And there's a lot more information in the tour. There are a lot more buildings in the tour because it includes the entire part of Table Mesa. And our focus is on mid-century modernism, because in historic preservation, there's certain areas that we are focusing on. You know, we've really done a good job, and the people who've come before us, to acknowledge the arts and crafts movement and the Victorian movement, the Mapleton Hills of the world and Pearl Street. But the new eras that are important, because every era in Boulder has importance to tell the story of Boulder, and that includes mid-century modernism. It also includes more representation of diversity being LGBTQ community, the African American community, the Latino community, and others. So Historic Boulder is focusing on that. That's more of our focus these days than the older buildings. But of course, when a great older building comes up and we have an opportunity to get it landmarked, we do that. In fact, our holiday house tour will be focused in December on University Hill. So I want to talk to you about mid-century modernism, because you probably hear a lot about it if you're talking to realtors, and anything these days that was built from 1950 on, they call mid-century modern. But mid-century modernism is a specific design approach. It's not just a time period, it's a design approach. And it began after World War II, when the United States emerged as the most powerful country in the world. There was an amazing amount of prosperity going on in the 1950s and 60s. Americans had returned from the war with more of an international approach and view on the world, and a lot of the ideas from mid-century modernism came from Europe, came from the Bauhaus, came from France and England. And there were architects, in fact, who were kicked out of those countries because they were too radical, and they came to this country. And those people were Mies van der Rohe and the whole Bauhaus group, Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, and then Le Corbusier, the French architect, came and did some work in this country. And then, of course, we had our homegrown architect, Master Frank Lloyd Wright. So all of those architects have important design ideas that you'll see in some of the buildings that we'll see today. It's going to be primarily focused on architecture today, but there's an aspect of the history of Boulder that made Table Mesa possible, and that is the federal labs. The federal labs, when they came to town, came to a part of town where there was no houses. It was everything kind of south of Baseline Road was ranches. In fact, this was this neighborhood specifically is the Highland neighborhood, and yes, and Highland Park. It was a subdivision that was developed in 1952 on 72 acres of the Kohler Farm right here, and it did so well in terms of the development that 10 years later, the Table Mesa development happened on 555 acres of the Veely Ranch. And that was because when the Bureau of Standards came to town in early 1950s, there was this decision by the city to permit growth to happen on the south side of town. And so developers started building. Martin Acres was the first one, and then Highland Park and Table Mesa grew. That, the Bureau of Standards, NIST, spawned NOAA and NCAR. What was going on historically is when Truman was going to Europe, meeting with Stalin and Churchill to figure out how to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese, and then what to do with Europe afterward, he saw whole cities destroyed, capital cities destroyed, and he decided, Truman, that it would be smart not to have the whole brain trust of science concentrated in Washington, D.C., where he expected the Russians were going to destroy Washington. They all thought that was going to be the next war. Well, it turned into the Cold War. It wasn't an overt war, but there was an interest to move those scientific research centers to safer places, further away from areas where they could be bombed or shelled from the Navy or submarines. And so Boulder was one of the areas selected. One, it had a university. Two, the city was donating the first 72 acres of land at NIST. Three, there was the town wanted growth to happen. And so it was, nowadays it's a little different, but the town wanted growth to happen. And so that started to develop. And there was an interesting thing that happened between the scientists and the university. The scientists found that the university it didn't cut the mustard. The physicists, the level of quality of the classes and the research going on there was not as good as they wanted. So they started populating the professor positions with the scientists from NIST. And the university, look at it today. I mean, we have among the best sciences for a state college in the country. We have the satellites going up in space. We have astronauts from Boulder going up. So it's really had a huge impact in the culture of Boulder. That influence is not only the science, but the architecture that they chose was something that was scientific. It was logical, it was practical, it was rational, and it was modern. That's what modernism was about. And these buildings that you will see were lower cost approaches to design, where floor plans could be more open than the smaller compartmentalized spaces. Although if you were to go into these houses, the bedrooms are really tiny. They were more like cellular monk-like spaces. It was the living rooms that opened out with these big picture windows that would open out to the views, and the materials were generally wood, some stone, and very practical and pragmatic. that makes this area today really susceptible for redevelopment. Because oftentimes these are smaller houses, they weren't built expensively, so they haven't weathered all that well. And so when new owners come in, and even developers, they'll buy a house, knock it down, and put up a new house. And we're going to see that. If we could wave a magic wand, we would actually suggest that these two streets we're going to see today would be a historic district, to get some little bit of protection. So historic districts don't prevent change, they encourage adaptive reuse of buildings, and they allow anybody to do what they wish, primarily with the front facades remaining intact. So, but because these are oftentimes small houses on bigger lots, they're in danger of being scraped. So it's our hope that by bringing you knowledge about this area, you'll have more interest in understanding of maybe the next eras of historic preservation. So that's, let me see. The other thing about this neighborhood is there are not a lot of houses designed by architects. A lot of them were builders. So there was this builder approach like you see in Martin Acres, one house after another house after another house. These streets are different because they're up high and they're on these windy pieces of geology. And they also oftentimes have these great views. So the builders were willing to do things a little bit more not normal, a little bit more futuristic and innovative. And so we'll point out some of those things as well. And then just as we move from here, I think I want you just to walk out into the middle here a second, because you can actually look back at the quarry up here. So the quarry, and it's right there, that quarry is one of the quarries that supplied the stone for CU, for the University of Colorado. There was another quarry up at Sanitas, but they were shut down. Unlike you go down to Colorado Springs and you see that huge quarry along the face of town, we decided, the town fathers decided, or mothers decided, to protect our backdrop and stop the quarries from happening. So, and the sandstone that you will see on some of these houses, and I'll point that out, is sandstone that might have come from that quarry, but probably came more from lions.
How many of these are there in town?
How many quarries are there?
Yeah, it seems like Sanitas has some too.
Yeah, there's one there and there's one here, and I don't know of any others. Does anybody else know of any quarries in town? So there are a few architects who worked here, and I'll point those out as we go, because there's some significance. I want to start with this house. This is the very first one. And if you can't hear me, let me know. I don't have a megaphone, and I'm just going to try to project so you can hear me. This house is a modified A-frame. And if you think about A-frames, that was a really inexpensive way to provide a cabin in the mountains. So that whole notion of inexpensive cabin housing came down here and became one of the ways that people could afford to build in Boulder. And so that's an A-frame, except the top's been chopped off. That was that design approach. And there's a few of them you'll see around in this neighborhood. And that was a significant design movement in Boulder. The roof is shake shingles. It's a wood shingle. I don't think you can build that anymore in Boulder because of fire issues. So they're replacing that with asphalt shingles and metal. But so you can see that's an original shake shingle roof, A-frame style. The roof is the wall, and you don't have many windows on the roof side, but the ends usually have these terrific picture windows, and there's another one on the other side. So if you were to take that trail, you could see that big picture window. This house is a modified A-frame. So they started getting a little trickier. They took the A-frame that was a perfect triangle and they rotated it a little bit. And you can see that as we come down the hill. So you can see that it's a rotated A-frame. It has a very steep side right where the steps go up, and then it kind of flattens out, and then it has a rectangular pavilion of sort that cantilevers. That's where it's like a diving board, a swimming pool. It overhangs below, and you can see the structure, and you'll see that on several houses. It's a modernist approach to grab more floor area on that second floor by having the floor joists extend out past that way. And that type of siding, the vertical siding, is called board and batten, and it comes from barns. It was originally a barn approach to design. But then you can see underneath the eave of that roof, which overhangs, there are these big picture windows that bring a lot of daylight in. And that's north light, so it's not a hot sunlight, it's a cool sunlight. So it's a great kind of passive way to bring daylight into the house. So this next house is this one over here. This is more like a Frank Lloyd Wright style house. This was actually designed by an architect, and his name was Titian Papacristo, and there's a story about this guy. Yep. And part of the story about this guy is that I worked for him. I worked for him in New York City. So his story is that he came out here after graduate school. His wife was going to graduate school, and he became really great friends with Charles Hartling. They became partners. They started designing homes together, and then they had so much design talent between the two of them that they split off to do their own work. And they had different approaches to design. Both of them were inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright, and I'm going to show you some pictures of Frank Lloyd Wright design. This is like one of Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian style houses. It's really simple, but it has the floor plan, instead of being straight, rectangular, it has a soft curve to it. And it also has these rounded corners to it. Titian was from Greece. There's some other aspects of Greek architecture. This house was originally all white. So that I don't know if anybody's been to Greece, but those island buildings, all white. This has a board and batten style, but it's reverse. Instead of the batten sticking out, the batten is inset into the building. So it's a little bit of, architects like to do that. They would take an established design approach, and then they would twist it a little bit to give it a little bit fresh look, a little bit of a modern sensibility. I'm going to show you a few pictures now, and because the architecture that you're going to see today was inspired by people like this. So this is a Frank Lloyd Wright house. This is an early Frank Lloyd Wright house. It was his prairie style, which had a lot to do with these low, mostly two-story buildings, but with really broad hip roof overhanging caps on the building and clear-story windows. This would have been, I think this one is in Michigan. He did a lot of work in the Midwest. And we'll see one house that has a prairie quality to it today.
And what year?
This would have been probably around 1910 or 1915. He was influenced by Japanese architecture and the arts and crafts movement. This is probably his most famous prairie-style house. This is called the Roby House. This man sold bicycles. He had a bike shop, Mr. Roby. This is on the south side of Chicago. And it's owned now by I think the University of Chicago, and it's open to the public. And I'd highly recommend going to see it sometime. He had another movement of architecture. This was what he called the United States of America utopian architecture. He was trying to get people to be able, this is in the 1920s and 30s when the big depression hit. He wanted to make it possible for people to be able to afford an architect to design a house. They would tend to be small. I was just at this house last week. This is in Washington, D.C., near Washington. It's actually right next to Mount Vernon. It's 1,200 square feet. 1,200 square feet, but it lives larger than that because the living room has these high ceilings and it has lots of glass that look out onto this beautiful landscape. And we'll see Usonian style houses. Quite often they have flat roofs, and so we'll see that here on this walking tour.
Did you go inside?
I did yes, I did go inside. It was open for tours. And then this is another one. This is another Usonian house, two-story house in near Cleveland. Near Cleveland. Then the other style of architecture that we're going to see is this California architecture. It's Joseph Eichler. Joseph Eichler was a developer from the Los Angeles area. He developed 11,000 houses in his career, all the way up to Sacramento and down to Palm Springs. And they were almost always one story, really low sloping roofs, and he was influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright because he lived in a Frank Lloyd Wright house for a period of time. So you'll see that oftentimes the entry is right in the middle. There's high triangular windows at the top. Here's another version of that. This is classic mid-century modern California, late 50s, early 60s. And they're very popular now. An Eichler house is now inflated in price just because it was an Eichler house. So
He was a developer, was he an architect too?
he was not an architect.
That's interesting.
He was a developer, and he had some architects who he worked with, and he switched them out when he got tired of them.
I have a question with these really flat roofs.
Yeah.
How practical is that with all the snow and all that?
That's a great question. And so nowadays it's a lot more practical than it was then. So back then you would have tar and gravel as your roof material to keep the water out, which, you know, it's pretty primitive. Probably pitch is what you think about through the Middle Ages. Nowadays there's rubber membrane roofs, and rubber membrane roofs are really, you know, they're not exactly bulletproof, but close to it. You know, they can last 20 years before you need to replace it, which is longer than shingle roofs are these days. Shingle roofs are what, 10 to 15 years, something like that.
50,
Yeah.
up to 50 now.
Pardon?
You think up to 50 years now?
And shingle roofs?
Well, asphalt.
Asphalt shingles. Well, that's good to know. Yeah.
Up to 50?
Yeah. And I also want to say, I love this input. So totally. So
I just had one put on my house, that's how I know.
yeah, so great. So any ideas or thoughts that you have, this is a conversation.
So the weight of the snow wouldn't.
So the weight of the snow is not the issue of the roof itself. The structure is the issue of the roof. And so, yeah, you have to have a beefier structure to support the snow because it's not going to drip off the house like it would.
We have a flat roof that's relatively new in the last 3 years, and we have not had one problem, and it just drains off.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of solar panels.
All right.
so-
The other story about Titian Papacristo, and I'm going to relate it to a flat roof in a second, is he became really good friends with the director of NCAR. NCAR had not been built yet. Titian worked on the design of his house. His name was Walter Orr Roberts. Walter Roberts' wife, Janet, was on planning board and city council, and they were a dynamo couple in this town. And Walter hired Titian to be his architect to help him figure out how to approach doing NCAR. And so Titian helped select the site, researched other laboratory buildings around the country, and was involved in the selection of the architect that ultimately was I.M. Pei. So, and we would tour around in my car, and he would look at his houses like children, long lost children. And he would say, oh, they added to it, or oh, it looks great, and he loved Boulder. He even wondered out loud whether he made the right decision leaving Boulder, because Boulder was even more beautiful now than it was back then. There was a coal dust over town in the 50s because of the coal plant, and the coal mines. Anyway, this is more than you need to know. I'm going to keep walking now, and I won't be talking as much.
What year was NCAR built?
NCAR was built in the mid-60s. It finished in 1967. This is a new house, the mid-century modern style. It has a kind of a quality of Mies van der Rohe, like the German architect who did things more box-like, windows that were more almost like industrial or office building-like, and the cantilever. You can see that part of the building cantilevers out.
It's also on the market.
Oh, how much?
Oh, you don't want to know.
Yeah.
How many millions?
This is a classic A-frame.
Amazing house.
This next house is a classic A-frame. It doesn't look like it's been touched architecturally to change it. So you can see the shake siding is really weathered. It has a good, as they say, a patina. Yeah, question.
Can a house like this that hasn't been touched, can the Historic Society make it so they can't come in and take the shakes off and put something on?
No, the Historic Society can't do that. It has, actually, these people have to ask for it to become a landmark.
Oh, they have to ask.
They have to ask. We can knock on their door and say, we think this building would be excellent example as an intact A-frame house. Would you consider having it landmarked? And we've done that in the past, but we can't enforce that on their own property rights.
If it's part of an historic district, though, then is there some control?
Right, so that's another thing. Just I want to point out one thing as we're walking by. Look at the mailbox. It's like a mini me.
Oh, yeah.
So the question was of historic districts. Historic districts also have to be approved by the neighborhood. You can't just make an edict, you know, like an emperor and say this is going to be a historic district. All the historic districts in town had to have at least 50% of the residents want to have it become a historic district. If it becomes a historic district, then design guidelines are written so that when changes are made, which they invariably always are, to houses, they have to follow certain design principles to the house.
Is Mapleton a historic?
Mapleton is a historic district.
Is there a name for that design element on the balcony where they have a Y shape, or is that just decoration? I've not ever seen that.
Yeah, that's great. You have a great eye to catch that detail. I don't know what that's called. So when you come around here, you're going to see the support for that balcony has a kind of an upside down Y, or like a wishbone. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. So the next house we're going to look at is this one over here. This one has aspects of it that look like it was influenced, if not designed, by the architect Hobart Wagner. Hobart Wagner was the most successful, prominent modernist architect in Boulder, designed over 200 buildings, his firm. And what makes it very much like Hobart Wagner is he was really into these rational vertical panels. They're almost like full sheets of plywood, probably 4 feet wide, 8 feet tall, with a batten every so on. He also has what's called a bird's mouth, that little triangular shape to the roof and the rafter that sticks out. That has a Japanese quality to it, kind of pagoda-like, but not exactly. It's also cantilevered, so the second floor cantilevers over the floor below. So there's, you'll see we're on a hill, pretty much this whole tour is on a hill. There's a walkway that is like a gangway that walks you over the lower level. So the house is a walkout on the lower level. The upper level is pretty much, looks like a one-story building here, but it's a two-story building. And interestingly, when we came by here on touring, watch out, there's a car coming. When we toured a month ago, the owner of this house came out and he said, everything that I'm saying isn't true, that this is not a historic district. This house was poorly designed, and it's not architecturally interesting. So,
Oh, you're kidding.
yeah. So it's just interesting, the different perspectives of people who live in the houses and to the people who don't live in them but appreciate them. Yeah. And I was kind of hoping he was going to come out again. Um, and you can see it's got a really nice inset like Romeo and Juliet balcony up there. This house is newer, probably 1960s, 70s, but it has a lot of those aspects. It has the cantilevered balconies, it's got the exposed rafters, the structure of the building becomes the ornament. So part of the mid-century modern movement was not to add ornament to buildings, but let the architecture, the structure, the siding, the materials be the ornament of the building itself. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then this is 1990s, and this looks like there was a group of architects in New York. I worked for one of them. They called themselves the New York Five. They did a lot of things in white, and their work was influenced by the architect Le Corbusier, the French architect. And this building has that, the concrete that comes right up to the building, and then the building sits up. It's not really part of our tour, but I'll talk about anything you want. Yep.
So were those people, Mies van der Rohe, kind of acolytes?
Which people?
Your five.
Yes,
It has
they
got
were.
a box.
They were more Le Corbusier acolytes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this is an interesting one. This is a double A-frame, asymmetrical. So the peak is not centered; it's a little off-centered, and between those two shapes, there's a little terrace between the two pavilion forms. So you have a little outdoor sitting area, and this is just a really beautiful, classic, modern, mid-century modern design.
You mean between the two?
So on the back side, between those two, there's a little, so there's probably a little walkway that connects the two pavilions, and then there's a little sitting area outside there. Yeah.
So when you've been in that house, that's why you know that?
No, I know because I think I've walked around to take a look at it. So architects,
Terrace, how wide?
it's not very big,
Like 10 feet?
probably 8 feet. Yeah.
So when you declare something a historical area,
Yes?
does that mean every ugly house and not significant house has to stay as is?
So that's a great question. The question was, when you create a historic district, then does every house, whether it has architectural or historical merit, contribute and have to live up to the design guidelines? And the answer is not exactly. There's contributing and non-contributing in every neighborhood. So if you buy a non-contributing house, you have more leeway. They certainly encourage you to design within the vocabulary of the neighborhood, so it feels like it fits in, but it's not as restrictive. So, yeah. This is, you'll see this is like a little dormer that is built, a shed dormer, like a side saddle on a horse, right? And you'll see this on a few of these A-frames to get some windows and a little bit more space. This is almost like a prairie style, very low pitched roof, and balconies, rooftop. So that was one of the things the Europeans believed in, is if you built a house, why not occupy the roof? Why not have that be a terrace? And so you see that over the garage here, it's a terrace. So you can see, here's an example of what probably is the future of this neighborhood, is one building after another is being torn down. There are houses on the market, and a bigger building, quite a bigger building is being built, because the lots are generally pretty big.
Are these two separate houses?
No, this is one house.
No.
Yep, so that's the garage, and then there's, it's going to connect over.
I see.
Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Leonard, I have a question.
Yeah.
For homes that have like the wood paneling or wood shake,
Yep.
how does historic Boulder think about like wanting to preserve these things, but also thinking about the fire risk?
Yeah, so we are totally supportive of the fire issues. That's the
Yeah.
life, safety, health.
Yeah.
That's the primary issue. So, yeah. So this house is not on the tour because, well, It is. It is one of those asymmetrical A-frames, and you can see that along the end profile here. But it's been expanded. It was originally not this large, but it's been remodeled. So, you know, that this would be one of those questions. If this was a historic district, would the original house been permitted to get this free with the design changes? And I don't have an answer for that. I have to say, though, that I think if it was a historic district and if there was not a house here, this house did a great job in fitting into the flavor of the neighborhood. Yeah, but with a more modern sensibility. That roof is a really expensive standing seam metal roof.
What are those white things? It keeps the snow from coming down?
Right, so those white things are just that. They're ice dams, so that if snow starts to slide in the winter or ice, it won't come crashing down.
So Leonard, were these dormers part of the original, do you think, or was it just a flat roof?
I can't speculate. What do you think? I'm not sure. So there are two modified A-frames right next to each other here. This one's a little bit harder to see because the trees have grown up here. But again, it has that whole wall of shake shingles. This one has been modified with an addition in the back. I believe these shake shingles are not shake anymore. I think they might be concrete. So they make a concrete tile that looks like that. Yeah.
So in Boulder, you can't replace a wood roof.
You cannot.
With wood.
Yeah, you'd have to make it fire resistant. Yeah. And there's another question about historic preservation. That's windows. So particularly in the oldest houses in town, some of those houses have single pane, handmade glass. And back in Washington, D.C., where I just was, that's part of the story of the house, But here, there's a struggle about energy efficiency versus historical accuracy. And I'd say that right now, who's winning is the energy efficiency. And I think historic preservation is going to change with the times a little bit. But there always are, it would be great. There's something called embodied energy. So when you make a new window, all the energy that it takes to make it, to mine it, to fabricate it, and to ship it to the site is a tremendous amount of energy. And when you take an old window out to replace it with a new one, you'll probably never make up the energy that it took to make that window in the energy savings of having a double pane window. Your energy bills will be lower, but if you think about generationally what we're doing to the country, the embodied energy is sacrificed for something that says, well, it's new and it's a nice intact window. So anyway.
It's the same idea as batteries and
Yeah.
the energy it takes to build a battery. It has to be factored into the equation as
Absolutely.
well. The best writer on this is Smill, Vaclav Smill.
Yeah.
So this is interesting with the rounded concrete underneath.
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. It has it's stucco over it, and it's an unusual house, and it's definitely been modified since. So it's not really mid-century modern; it's newer than that. But it has a really interesting character. It almost has a little Santa Fe quality to it on the lower level. Yeah.
So what happens if the old windows in a historic district leak, are not fitting properly?
So there's a couple ways to deal with it. Most of those houses have storm windows. So you put a storm window on the outside of it, and it gives you your second layer. And it also gives you like a 3-inch air barrier instead of the 1/2-inch air barrier in a single window. So that can be a better barrier than the 1/2-inch. The other thing is people they go to McGuckins and they get tape or insulation to put around the window during the winter. So that's what people do. So. Yeah, so if you have a house that's landmarked, then you get a tax break if you were to do a remodel or an addition to it. There's not a tax break specifically in Boulder for a house just because it's a landmark. But the state just doubled the amount of money that it's willing to give for tax breaks. So the pool of money is greater. And then Bob, who's here, Bob was the mayor of Louisville, and during his time, he really created a better system for financial benefits for landmark structures. You want to mention that?
So we passed a percent sales tax that goes into a preservation fund that supports people who want to landmark their houses, or people who have houses that are landmarked but have more expensive. Has anybody been to the 740 front restaurant on downtown Louisville? That was large. A whole bunch of money went into that building from the historic preservation fund, because they needed new structural everything underneath the building. So anyway, it's a a carrot as opposed to a stick. I mean, if you landmark your house, you get like a $10,000 thank you bonus to start, and then you can apply for money from the fund to do work on the house.
Yeah. So Boulder has a ways to go to try to emulate that. There's another modified A-frame house. It's a little hard to see back in there. And then this one is another one of those double asymmetrical houses. And you can actually almost picture that there's a little terrace connecting the two portions of the house. So, and this stone would have been the local sandstone, the lions, or it might have been the like the sandstone that you see near the Royal Arch, that kind of thing. That's our stone. This next one on the left, I wanted to point out, this has like a pagoda roof shape. Car coming. No, it has a skylight right over the top. You can just see a little soft dome shape up there. So there's a skylight.
Like that downtown savings and loan place.
That's right. The atrium building, right. Yeah, it's really nice.
Who did the design? You know?
This house?
Yeah.
I don't know. Let me see if I can even find the year of it. It was built in 1966, and that's all we know. We don't know who the architect was. It has kind of a California modern meets the Far East look to it.
So
Yeah.
is this street, would you like to do historical also? I mean, is the Historical Society trying to make as many blocks historical? Just since I know nothing about
Yeah, it's a good
guys.
question. I would say it's our mission to educate people to appreciate the history and the value of the buildings that are here. If they then want to make it a historic district or landmark their house, we're happy to do that. It's not necessarily our mission to try, that's not our first priority, to landmark or make historic districts. It's primarily to raise people's awareness of the full story of Boulder and how different eras have contributed to the amazing place that we live in today. And we'd be happy if the residents here were interested in this. Our next step will be probably to put a little flyer on each of the doors of these houses and say, did you know your neighborhood is now on the Pocket Sites Tour, and you can learn a whole lot about the amazing contribution of your neighborhood to Boulder, and see what happens. And maybe have an open house to have residents go on this walking tour.
So you could have spotted places that are landmarked, but not a historical district.
That's correct. You can have an individual landmark versus a whole district. Yeah. What is that wood?
Cedar?
You know, you would think that they would have used,
Yes.
Oh, wow, do I have a great guessing ability.
Yeah, thanks. Love to talk to you about it. That's the guy who hates the idea, who lives in that house on the corner. Maybe he'll catch up to us.
But so do you take into consideration, if you wanted to landmark that house, and the person living in it said, this should not be landmarked, is not, and maybe it's because they want to sell it for a higher price, whatever, do you get to override that owner?
No, so Historic Boulder is a not-for-profit volunteer organization. We are not a city agency. The city does have a preservation department within the planning department, but we have no legislative or enforcement capability. We're just an advocacy and education group. If somebody didn't want their place landmarked, it's really hard to get it landmarked against their wishes. It's been done once in 50 years, I think, in Boulder. I don't have, I'd have to go to our preservation committee to find that out. But it's really rare, and it's something we've actually suggested it a number of times to keep the people from demolishing their house and to have them understand the historical value of it. And quite often when they see that it has some historical value, and they are convinced that it's not going to decrease the property value of their house, then they'll say, oh, I won't tear it down, but I don't want it to be a landmark. Or they'll say, oh, maybe I'll make it a landmark, but not right now, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Is this a cute little house?
Yeah, so this is one of those, this is what this neighborhood is becoming. And it's a beautifully designed house, don't get me wrong, it's really magnificent. It's got stone, it's got the board and batten siding, it's got metal roof, it's really nicely composed, it's beautiful. And it could be that every other property in this neighborhood could become this. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we lose and what do we gain? And that's really up to you to decide. From our point of view, we think it's important to save pieces of neighborhoods or really important buildings that tell a story of how Table Mesa came to be and the historical and the design approach.
As they're constructing.
Yes. Yep. Oh, some shade. I noticed you admiring that, I think it's a smoke bush.
Yeah, yeah,
I've always liked those.
yeah. They're so unique.
Yep. So there's not a lot right here on the tour, so we'll just keep walking downhill. If you have any questions or want to know more about Historic Boulder, I can keep talking, so keep talking. Yes, question.
My question is, back when you mentioned Eichler and the California style horizontal, is that when garages came to the front, or,
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would have to say you're right on that, because California has really been a car dominated culture in all the best ways, drive-ins and Happy Days and American Graffiti and all those, and then you've got the freeways that are 16 lanes wide, and cars became something that people adored. They polished their cars, right? And so they started to celebrate the car by putting it into the front of the house.
Alleys disappeared. There weren't alleys.
Right. So that was the other thing. They decided not to hide the car by putting it in the alley, but to celebrate it by putting it into the front. Also takes less real estate. When you have an alley, it takes a little bit more real estate than the smaller sizes. So this is a mansion being built right here.
It's not the same architect as that other one?
I don't think so. The other thing I want to point out, those houses up on the hill, those are houses along Vassar Drive. So we're not going to go to Upper Vassar, but I would encourage you to consider doing that on your own another time, or just do it through your Pocket Sites app. But Upper Vassar has those views, and you can see those houses are really small, but their living rooms are vaulted high ceilings with picture windows that look to the north, probably all the way almost to Long's Peak. And the ones on the other side of Vassar look south to the Flatirons and NCAR. So this neighborhood was unique among many in Table Mesa to give those great views. And so a small house could still have a big feel to it. Historic Boulder, I'll tell you the story about Historic Boulder. Historic Boulder started 52 years ago when 3 buildings were being threatened to be torn down. One of them was the Highland School, which we saved. One of them was the Union Depot, train depot, which we saved. It's out now it was moved, this train station. And the other was the Central School, which was the first version of Boulder High School. It was pretty much right where the bus station is in downtown Boulder now. So they tore that down, and that catalyzed a whole group of people in 1972 to found Historic Preservation Not-for-Profit. And in doing so, the next step was to write the Historic Preservation Ordinance in Boulder so that there were laws and regulations giving guidance to the city on which buildings should be preserved or which neighborhoods should be preserved. And so we've been working for 50 years, over 50 years, of succeeding generations of Historic Boulder members. And currently we've got about 350 members. Our newsletter goes out to over 3,000 people. And we have former city council people, former business leaders in town, some national experts in preservation on our board who've continued to advocate and help us with our mission to tell the story of how the culture of Boulder has been enhanced by the preservation of different periods of design and history in town.
And the inside of a historic house can be changed. Like there's asbestos, there's this, there's that. Or do you have to maintain the integrity of the inside?
So no, so it's a good question. So the question was, when a building is landmarked or if it's in a historic district, what are the regulations about the interior of the house? And there are none. There's no protection for the interior. We certainly hope that the people who landmark their house also appreciate the historic aspects of the interior. But changes always are being made to those houses. And there is a legal way to protect an interior with an easement. And so you can get protective covenants and easements on the inside of houses, but that's really rare. There's maybe 2 or 3 in Boulder, and that's it.
Where they can't change the interior.
Where they can't change it without review. Right.
They did that by their own choice, the homeowner?
Yes, they did it by their own choice. The other thing I want to talk about, we are continuing to help property owners to preserve their buildings. And the most current one is the Boulder Theater. Have you all been to the Boulder Theater? Yeah, it's this amazing Art Deco building right off of Pearl Street Mall. It was built in 1938 as a movie palace. And the facade is actually cracking because water has infiltrated behind it. And so we are teaming with the Boulder Theater, and we just were able to get the state to help us with a grant to help pay for the restoration of that. So this is a newer modern house. This is probably more like a 1980s modern era, but it has the same, you have a good eye, has the same boxy rectangular with the high windows just below the eaves, the balcony, and inexpensive stucco material there. But it looks like it could have been expanded because it's quite large. Yes, so the question was, do we have an opinion about whether there's other neighborhoods that could qualify as a historic district? And not only do we have that, but the city has outlined some areas that we think should be or could be considered as a historic district. And so we tried to get University Hill, as a historic district. It's too big of an area, so since then there have been little pockets that have been turned into historic districts, that 4, 5, 6, 7 houses. We've looked at Whittier, and again, that's too big of a district, and quite a few absentee landlords who didn't want to have the district be, the area become a historic district. So there are places like that, and this is the second modernism tour that we have on pocket sites. We're planning a couple more lower below Flagstaff, that neighborhood, upper Chautauqua area. There's a lot of innovative houses quite like this, but more of them were built by architects in that neighborhood. And there's also a program within the city called the Structures of Merit program to identify buildings that are significant but have no restrictions on their adaptation. But it gives them and the owners an understanding that they're living in a building that could qualify as a landmark. So.
So what, on this,
Restrictions
seems
we've
like
had,
the
which were way more than
reputation
we thought
of
we
getting your house landmarked or area is that it puts all these restrictions that make it impossible to do anything.
That's how a lot of people feel.
That seems like that's what
That's the perception.
perception.
Right.
We had my mother's house landmarked, okay? And there were very little restrictions, but then everyone was like, no, it's gonna
So on this pocket app,
Yes.
you just go to, how do you, what's it under, how do you get that?
You go to pocket sites. You
Pocket
just look up
sites.
pocket sites, and you'll find you can just S-I-G, I think it's S-I-G-H-T-S. Yep.
pocket sites.
Yes.
I wouldn't use the house.
Yeah.
Picture of the history of the Art Deco Boulder Theater, like the art itself is sort of suggestive of sensuality or sexuality, and all. It's a lot of the imagery in the building. What was this backstory?
I will talk about it, but I want to talk about this house really quickly. So this house is one of the few landmarks in the entire Table Mesa area. This house is of the Alice and Donald McDonald house, designed by George Norman Wells in the prairie style. It was landmarked in 2020. It was definitely designed by, influenced by the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright.
When was it built?
And it was built in 1967. And the different reasons that people want to landmark their house is they want to honor important persons or family members associated with the building. They want to ensure that a valued building is protected from extensive alteration or demolition. They may want to take advantage of state and federal tax credits. And some of them, just like there's a little bronze plaque that is on the house, and they love that, and they want it. They don't necessarily do it because it's going to jack up their resale price. It doesn't hurt their resale price, and so this house has some interesting elements. It's got angled forms, like triangular shapes. The brick you can see just highlighted at the corner is overlap tooth, like your fingers could do, to accentuate just something that's really basic. That the ornament now is the brick and the way the brick is patterned there. It's got these stucco panels below the windows that are cantilevered out, both probably in a bedroom there and over the garage. And it has the low hip roofs that Frank Lloyd Wright used on the prairie style architecture.
It's got like a hexagonal
and a nice wall.
Yeah, the hexagonal chimney. Quite often in Wright's houses, the chimney was literal center of the house. And the kitchen and dining room were right around it. The living room was on one side and the bedrooms were on the other side. So there was a question about the Boulder Theater and the Art Deco design and style of it. Somebody recently commented that if you look at the front facade of the Boulder Theater, it has phallic design quality to it. And if you think about the Art Deco design style, it came about in the roaring 20s when social mores changed quite a bit. There was a sexual liberation going on, and that was celebrated in not only the architecture, but in a lot more nudes in art and sculpture, stylized. So they didn't look hyper realistic. They were toned down to be more artistic, but it was still a nude. And the curvilinear lines are oftentimes related to the human body, the curves of the human body. So there's a connection that way. You also, inside, there's an Art Deco styling of agriculture. I think there's flowers and wheat and things like that. So there's both a celebration of the local area and then the bigger Art Deco movement, which really started in France. In fact, the name Art Deco came from an exhibition in Paris in the 1920s. So in the bottom of the house?
In the windows?
I don't know.
It might have been, I think I had a friend that lived there.
It looks like there's,
Doesn't it look like a swimming
it could be.
Yeah, because you don't see any
Could be a lap pool.
chairs around it. Yeah.
So we're gonna walk up a hill now. So
This is the cardio part of the tour.
yes, this is we're getting our exercise a little bit here. And we're gonna head up this part and then cut over. And right at the corner is a house that was designed by Charles Hartling in curvilinear, not unlike Art Deco, soft curve forms, very geometric, but not hard geometric, not circles, but more soft curves. And I had a conversation with the owner, who is a relatively new owner, and he says he loves the building. He is honored to be a steward of the house, and he said that they're taking good care of it, but then a week later I heard that they're planning to pop the top. So hopefully they're going to do it in a sensitive way that is sympathetic to the architecture of the house. It has no protection, has no landmark protection, so you can do what you wish with your money.
I could get the roof if they pop it off and put it on my little ranch house.
I did tell him that.
I'll take it.
I told him that I could introduce him to the children. Yeah.
But maybe he'd like to sell you the roof. If he could take the roof off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Put it on my I'll take
Plunk
my
it down.
roof off.
You might have to modify your floor plan a little bit to get it to fit the curves. How's everybody doing? Knocking up. I think it's the Drake house. I'm not sure. This is the Hartling design. And anyway, that particular site, it used to be a ranch, the Chambers Ranch. Then in the 1860s, 70s, they built a fort there to protect the white settlers from the marauding, they were not marauding, but that's the excuse, the indigenous people. And so there was a fort there, and that fort was then used by Colonel Chivington to muster 100 men from Boulder to fight at what turned out to be the massacre at Sand Creek. So 100 of the founders of Boulder were enlisted, who were good men, but they left it behind and they did this heinous crime. And so there's some storytelling that needs to happen on the property to tell about the connection to the Sand Creek Massacre and the founders of Boulder. And the house itself, then, the farmhouse, was turned into the Boulder County Poor Farm. So what was happening in the 1880s and 90s, there were a lot of out-of-work miners because the mines were shutting down. The first mines were shutting down. And I just missed that car. Eyes in the back of my head.
We'll tell you.
Yeah. And so there were a lot of down and out transient people living in Boulder, families. So they brought mostly the women and children to the poor farm, and they lived there on this farm. They expanded it. They built a dormitory there.
It was there?
It was there at this site in Velmont.
You're talking about the Valmont
So,
site, not the...
yeah, that's
Oh,
63rd.
okay.
Yes.
Oh, not here.
Yes.
Okay.
What's the name of the Valmont site again?
It's called Fort Chambers.
Fort Chambers.
Right. So there's so that was a way that the city was housing homeless people. They were having them who were able-bodied work on the farm there. There was another poor farm built later when that one shut down at Iris and Broadway. And part of the farming that went on there was the very early days of the Iris farm, Long's Iris farm. Yep.
Go to the old poor farm because they thought that was still home. They would walk.
They would walk, yeah.
Old one.
Yeah. So we are coming up to downhill. How's that feel? A little bit of downhill. So this is our first house. That's an Eichler design, classic Eichler. Low shed, triangular roof, the garage in the front entry setback. That building next to it is an upgraded version with local sandstone. Again, the low sloping, just barely not flat.
But the roof inside, how tall are the ceilings?
Well, so the ceilings are generally, in the bedrooms they just have flat roofs, generally, but in the living spaces they vault up. And they can be 11 feet at the peak and 8 feet at the ends. So, and then you'll see quite often between the garage and the entrance, there's a little private courtyard. Yep. And you don't even enter this part. That's a bedroom in the front of the house. The living room is on the back side with the big views out there. So it's a great design. There's even kind of a ceremonial gateway of sorts where the two roofs meet, and you walk underneath that to get into the inner sanctum of the entry.
But are there any landmark Eichlers in Boulder?
There are no actual Eichlers. These are Eichler style. As far as I know, there are none.
None.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, such an
Yeah.
iconic
Yep.
style.
And here we are. Here's another one. So this is one where the wall of the house just extends to become a part of the gateway entry to their entry plaza. The high windows in the bedroom, and then the living room on the back side. And then this one actually brought a few years, let's see, 2023, this house was on the market for $1,249,000. And if you want to look to see what those spaces are like inside, you can see what that higher ceiling.
This is when it was for sale.
This is when it was for sale. This was for sale last year. So you can see what some of those higher spaces look like with the big picture windows.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can see they update really nicely, and but they still have a fireplace and rafters oftentimes. This one again has that little brick wall that's a little plaza before the front door. And just one after another. And they're all built, let's see, let me get my...
There's some of these built up below Chautauqua, right?
I beg your pardon?
House tour we had last time on the numbered streets of below Chautauqua, there's like houses.
Yeah, there are some houses in Lower Chautauqua like this. So these houses were generally built 1963. There was a builder named Bud Kent's, and it has the sloping roofs and the entry courtyards and the celebration of the garage.
So is Eichler considered a mid-century modern architect?
He was a mid-century modern builder. He was, in many ways, he was more important than anybody else. more important than Frank Lloyd Wright in that aspect of mid-century modern, because he was in California and he produced 11,000 houses. Frank Lloyd Wright produced 200, maybe 300. And so 11,000 has a greater impact. Then you're in California, which is one of the media centers of the country. And you see these buildings in movies from, and TV shows, Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver. This kind of design was transmitted across the country as the kind of style that Hollywood liked, that was hip. And so Boulder became, a copycat of that.
Who was the builder you're talking about?
How do you spell
So that was Eichler, Eichler. But this, there were two here. Bud Kentz, Kentz, was the builder. And we passed a house, the likely architect was Joseph Krabacher. He also designed some homes in Denver, this architect, very similar. So we're making our way down. This is an A-frame house that somebody wanted a tree house, so they built an addition that's way up there in the sky. It's like a 3rd story or something, but you can still see the original A-frame and then the addition to it.
There's a house on 15th Street between, I guess I'm going to say, Mariposa and Bluebell. It's been on the market for ages, but it has the original, what looks like a stone, totally different than the modern house behind it.
Oh.
And I wonder if they were required, Boulder required them to keep that original little stone cabin. No.
Yeah. So this house is a unique one. There's just a kit of parts. So there's a garage and then the main house. They rotated the garage at a different angle than the main house. And what it did is it opened up a space between the two houses. That was not cookie cutter box. It had a little bit of an angle to it that gave it a little bit more personality. It's also done in sandstone. The whole thing is sandstone, very beautifully detailed, rusticated, and it looks definitely hand like they thought about where each stone was going to go on this building.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes. So the Frank Lloyd Wright house that I looked at this weekend had a narrow strip window in the kitchen. This is another Eichler style. Again, you get the high windows in the bedroom, so the bed is down private below that, and then the high windows there, and then the back of it has the big picture windows. This is a modified, so this is a split level house. You have the garage at one level, you have a lower level that you walk half a flight down to below the balcony, and you have an upper level that's a half a flight up. That was really popular in the 60s and 70s, split level houses. And then you have these kind of vertical panels of brick and then vertical panels of stucco and windows. It's a little bit more rational, kind of like Mies van der Rohe approach. This next house here was, I believe, once shake shingle. They took all the shakes off and they put stucco on it. And it has this, it's almost like Mayan architecture. It's got, or French mansard, it's got these sloping angles on the garage and then on the main house, and then big windows. I've been down on the street below there, and they've got these incredible windows that look out toward the Flatirons and up to NCAR.
Do they have a view maintenance thing in these neighborhoods?
So in Boulder, they have a solar shading issue, so you can't build an addition that would shade your neighbors' solar panels. So,
And it's a calculation.
so this is another. This is an updated, somebody remodeled this one, but it still has the same bones. It has that kind of mansard / Mayan architecture to it. Lots of windows, just, tremendous. You can see all the way through to the back windows. And then I don't believe that's actually stone. It might be slate. It's not local sandstone below. And then they did this nice cantilever on the garage.
Yeah.
On the other side here, this is actually one of my favorite houses if I was looking to downsize. This is a classic. This is a carport style, California, mid-century modern, with the windows up high under the eaves at the bedroom, and then the back has the high windows in the living room. It actually has a walkout on the lower level, and you can see barely. There's some windows, if I could see through my sunglasses, right down there in the basement, so you can see there's a lower level. So it's probably twice as big as it looks, but it's still a pretty small footprint. This one across the street is also one of my favorites. It has a lot higher level of detail to it from an architect's conceit, I have to say. The window mullions are not just a single piece of wood, but it's like 3 pieces of wood. There's 2 on the outside. It's sandwiched like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? With the mullion set back. And it goes all the way down to the lower level. So there's windows below the balcony and windows above the balcony. And then this fireplace with kind of the random stone that breaks up the regularity of the rigor of the window patterning with the irregularity of the way the stone was laid out. It's just and then there's another piece of it above the garage. So there's an upper level with the same wood window mullion detail. Architects get excited about those little details, but it can add interesting texture and that extra element of ornament to a otherwise more plain house. Yeah, I know. It looks like it's an addition to me. I bet that was a 1-story and then they popped the top there. But they did it in a really good way. Yeah.
I've never seen windows like that in a garage door either.
That's a cool,
nice little touch.
yeah, you're starting to see those now. This is a classic Eichler style. Big picture windows now, except the living room is here on this side of the house, so it's got the big picture windows. And we're loving your house.
Architectural tour.
And we're almost to the bottom. How's everybody doing? Yep. So, yeah, hot. It is hot. So here's a really fun one. This is, it's like, you've heard the expression, keep Boulder weird. Keep Boulder weird. Well, it's got this ceremonial entry. It's like a certain way you see in Washington, D.C., where there's a platform of steps that go to the main door in between these 2 volumes of the building that are this Mayan mansard style.
Built it around a tree.
Right. They built it around a tree growing up there.
So do you think the Mayan mansard style is kind of an evolution of the cutoff A-frame?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Another of the low sloping Eichler houses, again with a walkout level, lower level, takes advantage of the sloping site. And there's one more I want you to see, because it's a little bit of a lead up to where we're going, and it's this house. So this is an Eichler style house, but they made the facade out of concrete aggregate, which is what you'll more or less see up at NCAR. So and let's see if I have a year on this. 1964.
They all look like Brady Bunch houses.
Yes,
coming from California.
Yeah. So, so that's the gist of these 2 streets. We have 2 cars.
I brought my car.
Okay. We have 3 cars that we can shuttle people back up to your car so you don't have to walk.